Hey, welcome to Hardcore Mixing. Today I'm going to show you how I use a combination of aggressive EQ, compression, and sampling techniques to get a Michael Bay-esque, cinematic, so sweet that it makes the devil poop God's pants snare drum sound. Now a little Warnerino for your morning cappuccino. This is not a tutorial on how to get natural sounding drums by playing by the rules. Graham over at The Recording Revolution already has several really great videos on how to get a nice clean snare sound. But this is hardcore mixing, and I don't just mean hardcore the genre, I mean hardcore the approach. So this mix-through series is going to show you how a litany of rule-breaking no-nos can have your ears going, oh yeah. Glenn Fricker at Spectre Sound would have an aneurysm if he saw the ungodly, extreme, and unnatural processing techniques that I'm about to show you today. I can promise, however, that the results will be pretty cool, and you'll walk away having learned a thing or two. Now that the disclaimers are out of the way, let's hop right to it. Here's the drum sound with nothing on it, just nothing going on, just the drums. And here's where we want to end up. So already, I'm sure you can tell, it's a lot more in your face, a lot more aggressive, just really huge and cool and unnatural, like I said. But today, we're just going to focus on the snare drum. However, I'll be covering the entire mix in future videos. Here's how the snare drum sounds with no effects and no sampling. And here's how it sounds after I'm done torturing it with processing. That was a pretty big difference. That's the goal though. If you want larger than life drum sounds, the key is to make them sound larger than they did in real life. Let's start by adding in the samples. There we go. And we're not going to be shy here. I'm not going to pretend that I did everything I could do first and samples were a last resort, and I'm so sorry. Please forgive me for I've sinned. Hail Mary, Father of Buddha, blessed to the Bland Canyon. God bless my soul, rest in peace. It's not like that. I like to think about it like when you're making a movie and you want a monster in the scene, right? But obviously you can't film a real monster because monsters aren't real, dummy. So during filming, you use a dude in a motion capture suit, and the suit dictates what the monster does. You know? Does that make sense? So for what we're doing, the original snare track is the motion capture suit. In this case, our monstrous snare is the sum of the real snare and the sampled snares. So we're going to add those in, and we'll listen to how that sounds. You might be curious, I have a track here called Real Sample. Why would I call something real sample since samples are fake? Well, what I do, and I'll scroll out so you can see here, is at the beginning of every session, I just do a run around the kit, grabbing a bunch of snare hits, a bunch of tom hits, a bunch of, whatever. And the reason I do that is, suppose we get the perfect take. The drummer just nailed it, but during one of the fills, he was a little wimpy on like a snare or a little wimpy on a tom. I take those samples and I just kind of slip them in underneath the original recording. That's why you have the real snare track here, and underneath that in a folder bussing into it, I have this real sample track. So what I did was I left the feel of the original snare fill intact, and then I took all of these major hits and added in a sample underneath to give them like a superhuman level of consistency and power. Here's a before and after with and without that sample dubbed in. And with. Pretty subtle, pretty negligible, but I find that it helps reinforce the real snare sound, and more specifically, it helps trigger the sample track more consistently, which is a pretty big deal because you don't want your sample being loud and quiet, and jumping all of in between velocities when you want every hit to be super loud and super huge. So that sample has a dual function of reinforcing the existing snare as well as making sure that the sample track is super consistent. So now let's add in the VR sample. Here's before it and with it. Already way more present, way more up front. Let's listen to that in context with everything. So we have a snare drum happening, but it's just kind of happening. It's not huge, it's not crushing, it's not impressive, it's not fun to listen to. So now I'm going to walk you through all the processing I did to the snare drum to make it fun and aggressive and crushing and exciting. So let's start by soloing the real snare. I started with Debleeder by Wilkinson Audio. What this plugin does is it's basically a noise gate, but instead of using volume automation, it does equalizing automation. So it filters out the highs or the lows or whatever unnecessary frequencies there are. Let's do a before and after with that. You can hear that the bleed is still there. It's just the harsh frequencies that we don't want bleeding through are attenuated, which is pretty awesome, pretty fire, pretty dope. I'm stoked about it. Let's continue. I've got a huge hard-on for the Slate plugins. I always start off with a virtual channel. What this plugin does is it adds a little bit of saturation and a little bit of flavor that I find tasty. You don't really hear the difference on one track, but I have this on every single track. So by the end of a mix, I'm usually working with about 100 tracks. So 100 tracks of virtual channel add up, and they sound pretty sweet. On this one, I'm using the British N. Like I said, it's really subtle. You can't really tell a difference. But there's that. I follow that up with the FG76 Vintage preamp. So if you look right here, that little orange light is going off every time a snare hits. What that light means is that I'm overdriving the input stage of the preamp. And what that means to our ears is there's a little bit of distortion every time the snare hits at the very tip top of the transient. And so that's taming the transients, reining them in just a little bit, as well as adding harmonic distortion, which helps the snare cut through on smaller speaker systems. Next, we've got the FGS, which is basically an SSL EQ. Let's do a before and after. So what I've done here is a 6 decibel high shelf boost at 5K. I wanted a little more mids, so I added a relatively wide 1.3Q 2-ish decibel boost at 1.25K. And then I've cut out about 3.5 decibels at 600 hertz at a pretty tight, pretty narrow Q, just to get rid of some of the gongy mid-range. And then I've gone to the lows here, and I've added almost 9 decibels at 240. So with all that in mind, let's do another before and after. And then I followed that up with the FGN, which is sort of a Neve design. It's just another EQ, it's another flavor. So on the Neve EQ, I wanted more highs on the snare than what we had after the SSL. So I cranked the high mid knob all the way to 7.2K, and I'm boosting it just about 6 decibels. I'm not being shy about it. And then the low end, at about 110-ish hertz, I've boosted 10 decibels. So between the two of these, that's 19 decibels of boost on the low end. So I'll show you what this sounds like before and after both of these EQs are added in. So already, it's punchy, it's in your face, and it's aggressive. It's becoming larger than life because we're doing things to the sound that perhaps break the conventional wisdom of what you're supposed to do to a sound. Now, I've heard from people, never boost, only cut. And I've also heard from people, if you're going to boost or cut, only boost or cut 6 decibels. If you do any more than that, you're cheating. You're not cheating. You're making a sound, and that's what our goal is here, is we're making a sound. So I followed that sound up with this custom series lift. See, I don't know if this is decibels, but I have the low process set to punchy, and I have it boosting 7. And then I have the high process on silky, and I have it boosting 2. So I'm giving it a little more thwomp and a little more sizzle on top. Let's do another before and after of that. And you can really hear it in the bleed from the kick drum. But also in the immediacy and the presence of the snare drum. If I were to characterize all the boosts and cuts I made on these 3 EQ units on a parametric EQ that sort of has a graphic interface, This is what it would look like. And if I was using something with an interface like this, I would have never made those aggressive boosts because I'd look at it and it looks wrong. But it sounds really good. So let's just close that, let's ignore that, and let's never use one of those again except for later when we actually do. And let's move on to the next thing in our chain, and that's a compressor that's specifically on the real snare track. So if you look here, it's latching on pretty hard on all the snare hits for about 7 decibels of gain reduction. I've got a 4-to-1 ratio. I've got the slowest possible attack, as well as a medium fastish release, but I'm blending it in parallel. So I'm using parallel compression to help make the transients of the snare pop a little bit. Let's listen to that again before and after, and I'll turn the mix up to 100% so you can really hear what's going on. So what that's doing is it's grabbing onto the transient and then tugging down to make that impact of the snare come out while reining in the sustain of the snare drum. After that, I'm running into virtual tape machines. And if you notice here, it's the same deal as the preamp module on the virtual mix rack. Every time the snare drum hits, it's going into the red. It's softening the transients, it's adding some saturation and some upper harmonic distortion, and it's making the snare drum a little more round and a little more forward without having to eat up all of our headroom. After that, I've added on a gate. That's got a blend of the wet and dry signal so that it just lessens the bleed even more so than the depleter up here was already doing. And I did something a little weird down here. On the real sample track, I did a low shelf, including the low mids as well as the lows. I scooped out some of the mids, and then I added another high shelf. What that did to the sound of the underlying sample is it took it from this natural sounding, open, woody snare sound and turned it into this thuddy, muddy sort of an impact more than a drum sound. And the reason I did this is I wanted to mangle the snare sound a little more with equalizing, but I didn't want to affect the bleed any more than I already had with the extreme EQ moves that I showed you earlier on. And so here's a before and after of that snare hit. It's really subtle, but it brings out some of the lower fundamentals of the snare track. Next, let's add in our actual sample track, which I believe was a VR sample. You can get those at vrmusicgroup.com. Here's how it sounds by itself and in context. And without, and with. And let's go back to the whole drum mix in context so we can hear what we have so far. So the snare is still kind of buried in behind everything. The low end impact is cutting through, but I'm finding that the high end isn't quite making it. So what I did, I took just the sample track and I ran it through the same tape machine that I was running the real snare track through. And same deal. Every time the snare hits, it's going into the red and it's adding some saturation, which is dirtying up the transient a little bit and adding some upper harmonic saturation. After that, I put it through the same channel strip that I ran the real snare through, and then I added some EQ of my own. So let's see what I did here. So you can hear the difference when it's engaged and when it's not. All I did is I scooped out some of that low-mid gunk, while at the same time adding in a bunch of low-end to give the sample a little more body and a little more realism. Let's do a before and after with the EQ again. And with it. After that, I compressed the sample sound. To make it sound bigger, huger, and with a longer decay. And you'll notice that I blended it in 50% as well. So in full context, here's where we are now. So we're getting there. We're getting close. But I wanted to do something because right now I can tell that there's a snare, a real sample, and then a sample, and I don't like that. I don't want to hear that. So I ran all 3 snare tracks through another instance of the virtual tape machines to get a little bit more of that tape saturation and that warmth. However, this time around, when the snare hits, I'm not going all the way into the red so that the light's turning on. I'm just going up around the 0. To get a little bit of that warmth, let's do before and after of that. So you can hear the low end's a little more coherent and a little more gluey. After that, I added this custom series equalizer where I'm boosting about 2 decibels at 10K. I'm cutting about 2 decibels at 400. I'm boosting another 2 at 200. I'm doing a high pass at 138 and a low pass at about 13K. Here's how it sounds with and then without. It's not horribly different, it's just enough so that in context, this 10K boost is adding a little bit of shimmer to help the snare keep up with and get on top of the rest of the mix. The 400 hertz cut is getting rid of some of the mud, which in turn is also going to help the snare cut through. I've got a boost at 200 to give the snare a little more body to help it have that larger than life impact that we've been talking about all along. And then I just cleaned up the highs and lows with these cuts. Nothing too fancy, nothing too crazy, just enough to give the snare some edge. The earth EQ, I added 4 decibels. And what this is it's a low shelf, I believe. And then I also added a high shelf. So with these EQ changes in mind, here's our before and after within the context of the mix. It's blending in while also poking through that little bit extra. That's exactly what we want it to be doing. I then followed that up with the L1 Ultra Maximizer. Now there's very minimal gain reduction happening. All I'm doing here is controlling the very, very, very peaks of the transient so that no wayward peaks are going to be making our master compressor work overtime further down the chain. After that limiter, I've added this EQ, which has a high pass at about 100 hertz, followed by a little bit of a boost at the fundamental of the snare drum. And then we have a cut at about 1400 hertz. And this is taking away some of the upper mid-range honk. And then I've added some shimmer with a 2 decibel high shelf boost at 8K. I followed that up with yet another gate to really make sure that we're staying on top of the bleed. Here's how that sounds before and after. It's really not doing a whole lot. All this gate is an insurance policy. At the very end of the chain, I'm running Epic Verb on a plate setting with a medium decay 21 millisecond pre-delay at about 10% wet to 90% dry. And what that's doing is it's giving the snare some extra girth, some extra presence, and some extra space to really drive home that larger than life impact that we're going for. Here it is before and after the reverb. It's really subtle, but it does a lot in the context of the mix. So here is a before and after of all of this snare bus processing.
And that's all I have to say about that.
If you liked what you saw and felt like you learned something from this video, click that subscribe button. And if you really liked what you saw, consider supporting Hardcore Mixing on Patreon. The next time I see you, we'll be going over kick drum processing techniques. But in the meantime, feel free to listen to the finished mix right here on my channel. Till we meet again,
How awful.